Grandma remained seated on the kitchen floor, the lap of her dress wet from having washed the feet of an angel. Conchita stood beside her, one hand on a now empty chair and the other absently holding two freshly sharpened knives. Both were transfixed by the closed door, as if expecting an explanation of what had just happened to suddenly appear there. Little George, the one inhabitant whose role had been confined to observation, now broke the silence. "Where's Dad?" he asked. Indeed, that was the unanswered question, but not for long. With timing that made it certain George had passed the beggar as the beggar left the house, the door abruptly opened, and George stepped inside. His coat and hat were covered with snow. Standing on a mat, he stomped his feet, removed his coat and hat, and then hung them in the closet with a quick, intemperate gesture. Then he turned and lifted his gaze and witnessed a scene he did not expect. Across the parlor, framed by the kitchen doorway, his wife sat on the floor, wet from the waist down. Conchita stood to her left, and little George stood to her right. All three wore a look of amazement. George paused and then bit off a single word. "Yes?" Thelma, assuming he and the hobo had just passed one another, began by asking, Didn't you just... Little George bolted toward his father before her question could be completed. "Guess what, Daddy? Mommy gave your shoes to Santa Claus." George indeed had a special relationship with his shoes, but his response seemed disproportionate, especially given that it was Christmas Eve. "You did what?" he demanded in a loud voice. Thelma was backpedaling. Already unbalanced by the hobo's visit, she now had the additional complication of trying to explain the unexplainable. She made a commendable effort, but every particle of her storytelling talent deserted her. When she tried to offer the kind of detail listeners usually found captivating, the story sounded even less believable. Never before had she told a story so incredible that anything other than a bare retelling sounded like a lie. In fact, even the bare retelling came across like a fable. Intemperately, he brushed aside her insufficient efforts, looked at her as if she were a thief, and asked, "If you felt like giving something to a dirty Mexican vagrant, why didn't you give him something of yours?" That ugly sentence hung in the air like an insult, meant not just for Thelma, but for Conchita, who stood there, melting from his unkindness. Thelma and George instantly realized something had just been said that could never be redeemed. Whatever came next would be irrelevant to the wound George had inflicted. Thelma made no effort to give George a bridge toward an apology. She simply asked in a level and unforgiving tone, "You saw him then?" "Saw who?" he shot back. "Saw the man who has your shoes. How would you know who he was if you didn't see him?" George ignored her observation and doubled down on his original insult. I didn't see anyone, Thelma. I just assumed he must be Mexican." Then he turned to a girl who was as good as family and whose Christmas he had just ruined. And he spit out an order. "Get in the car, Conchita. I'll drive you home." What followed was an arduous ride that both knew would be their last. However, what George knew, and Conchita did not, was that shoes or no shoes, Mexican hobo or no Mexican hobo, her last visit to the big house on the Caney was over. George was seething with anger, not because of anything anyone had done, but because he no longer had a way to pay her. He had come home late on Christmas Eve because of how Christmas Eve had started. He had been struggling for several months to hide from everyone, including his wife, that the Bank of Oshaleta was becoming insolvent. He had been stringing out foreclosures and disguising bad loans for so long that it was becoming impossible to conceal the bank's precarious circumstance from bank examiners. It was a miracle he had managed to keep so many people in the dark until now. The significance of "until now" lay in the fact that his aim was to maintain the charade through Christmas. If he could make it to the new year, he thought, perhaps something might save him, or at the very least, he would have one more Christmas during which his family would remain unaware, even as they assumed the best. Then he could confide in them, reveal everything, and unwind the bank's meager assets in an orderly manner. But the morning of Christmas Eve, he arrived at the bank and discovered three things. First, the bank's vice president was nowhere to be found. Second, the bank's quite attractive head teller was absent. And finally, the vault had been cleaned out. He spent the rest of the day sequestered in his office, with customers knocking on a locked front door while he talked with the police, and every regulator eager to ask difficult questions. The last thing he wanted to do was drive home. He fortified himself with anger and self-justifying excuses. He wouldn't be in this situation if he hadn't trusted people who shouldn't be trusted. How would he have gotten into such ruinous circumstances if it hadn't been for Thelma and all he'd done to make her happy? And all those simpleton farmers, hadn't he tried to live large just to give them someone to be proud of, a local boy who made good? By the time he got home, he had parceled out blame to everyone except himself, and was eager to hold everyone else accountable. When he opened his front door, hell was in store for anyone on the other side. But by the time his round trip to Conchita's home had been completed, that anger, born of a need to defend himself, had run its course. Now, despair took over. A despair that would last for the rest of his life. He re-entered his front door bereft of excuses, naked of any anger and hoping to be forgiven. George sat at the same table that earlier had welcomed an angel, and admitted to his wife that they were now poor. The house they were sitting in was no longer theirs, and their one asset, a 1930 Packard, would soon be leaving town with them in it. and no specific destination. His first venture into humiliating self-confession came to an end. It was an admission about things Thelma had already suspected were true. George's one good eye was fixed on the table between them, the same table where an angel had been seated less than an hour before. Once his silence indicated he was finished, Thelma reached over, lifted his chin, and said, "We are going to get through this, trust me. I will make it happen." It would take years and a painful transformation on her part, but she would do precisely that.